The town of Hollow Pine had always been a strange place, hidden in the thick ancient forests of the Appalachian Mountains. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. It was a town frozen in time, with crumbling Victorian houses and a thick fog that clung to the streets even on the clearest days. My family moved to Hollow Pine when I was 10 years old. My father had taken a job as the town's new doctor, and my mother, a painter, was drawn to the old, quaint charm of the place. We moved into a large, weathered house on the edge of the woods, a house that, even then, gave me an uneasy feeling. The residents were peculiar, reserved, and spoke little, especially when it came to the woods. There were warnings about the woods, whispered stories of people who had gone in and never returned. My parents dismissed it as superstition, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, especially with the way the townspeople looked at us, as if they knew something we didn't. It wasn't long before I started hearing noises. It started as a soft whisper in the night, like voices carried by the wind. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing, just the silence of the forest and the impenetrable darkness between the trees. I told my parents, but they dismissed it as my imagination. "It's just the wind, honey," my mother would say, her voice quiet and dismissive. But it wasn't just the wind. The whispers grew louder over the next few weeks, taking on a more sinister tone. I could almost make out words, but they were in a language I didn't understand. Sometimes the voices seemed closer, as if someone or something was right outside my window. The worst nights were when the voices would fall silent, leaving only an oppressive, heavy silence that made my skin crawl. Then came the tapping. It started softly, a rhythmic tap-tap-tap on the walls of the house, always at night. I lay in bed clutching the blankets, counting the seconds between each beat, terrified of what would happen if I moved. My parents didn't seem to notice. The noises never woke them, no matter how loud they got. One night I woke to the pounding, louder and more insistent than ever. It seemed to come from all sides, surrounding me. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly sat up, my eyes fixed on the window. The pounding stopped abruptly, replaced by a single long scratch against the glass like a fingernail dragging across the surface. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I forced myself to look at the window, my blood running cold as I saw a face, pale and empty, staring back at me. The eyes were dark, empty holes, and the mouth was stretched into a grotesque, unnatural smile. I jerked away, falling out of bed, my heart pounding with terror. I blinked, and the face was gone, leaving only the faint outline of condensation on the glass, as if someone had pressed their face against it. I ran to my parents' room, sobbing and shaking, but they assured me it was just a nightmare despite the terror in my eyes. The next day I was exhausted, but something compelled me to explore the forest. I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to my fears lay in the dark, twisted woods. I walked in after school, with the sun setting on the horizon, casting long shadows that danced and flickered with every step I took. The further I walked, the more silent the world around me became. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisted and covered in thick moss that seemed to pulse with life of their own. My steps faltered as I noticed something strange. The forest floor was covered in small wooden effigies, rudimentary human figures tied together with rope. They hung from the trees, swaying gently in the breeze, their eyeless faces turned toward me. A sense of dread overcame me, but I couldn't turn back. Something was pulling me deeper into the forest, guiding me. The whispers had returned, low and insistent, leading me to a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a small, dilapidated cabin. The cabin looked ancient, with precariously leaning walls and a caved-in roof on one side. The door was open, creaking as it swung in the breeze. Despite every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself moving forward, drawn to the darkness within. As I crossed the threshold, the temperature plummeted, my breath steaming in the frigid air. The interior was empty except for a small, dusty table in the center of the room. A small, ornate box sat on top of it. The whispers grew louder as I approached, the voices barely intelligible now, urging me to open the box. My hand shook as I reached out, my fingers grazing the cold metal latch. With a deep breath, I opened the box. Inside was a small, shriveled heart, black and dry, as if it had been drained of life. But as I stared at it, the heart began to beat, slow and deliberate, pulsing with a dark energy that filled the room. The whispers grew louder, turning into a deafening chorus that threatened to overwhelm me. I stumbled backward, the box slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The whispers turned to screams, the air growing thick with the smell of decay. The walls of the cabin began to close in, the shadows stretching and writhing like living things. I turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The last thing I remember was the feeling of cold hands around my neck and the sound of my own screams echoing in the darkness. When I woke up, I was lying in the middle of the clearing, the cabin gone. The forest was silent, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a pale light over the twisted trees. I walked back to town, disoriented and terrified. But when I tried to tell my parents what had happened, they dismissed it as a vivid nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. The knocking returned, more persistent than ever. And now I see the faces everywhere, in the windows, in the reflections in the mirrors, in the shadows that flicker at the edge of my vision. They're getting closer, and I know they won't stop until they have me. I've done my best to write this, to warn anyone who might hear, but I fear it's too late. The darkness of the forest is coming for me, and I don't think there's any way out. If you ever find yourself in Hollow Pine, heed the warnings. Don't go into the woods, don't listen to the whispers, and whatever it is, don't open the box. The faces are waiting, and they are always hungry.